In the early 3rd century before the Common Era, the Mediterranean world was a patchwork of cultures, kingdoms, and empires, each shaping, contesting, and influencing the others across the waters that connected them. Yet, amid this mosaic, two powers were rising with ambitions that would soon collide. To the north lay the Roman Republic, a state still young, yet already hardened by conquest and political transformation. To the south stood Carthage, an ancient, maritime power built on commerce, wealth, and the mastery of the sea. Between them lay the island of Sicily, rich, fertile, and strategically indispensable. It was here, in this island between worlds, that history's longest continuous war of antiquity would ignite, the First Punic War. By 270 BCE, Rome's authority in the Italian peninsula was nearly complete. The Latin League had been dissolved, the Samnites subdued after decades of war, and the Greek cities of southern Italy, once under Pyrrhus of Epirus, had fallen under Roman dominance. The defeat of Pyrrhus in 275 BCE marked the end of the Hellenistic challenge to Rome's expansion in Italy. What had begun as a modest republic centered on the Tiber had transformed into a disciplined, militarized power. Yet Rome's reach remained confined to the Italian mainland, its armies formidable but its fleets negligible. The Republic was a land power, built on citizen legions, fortified colonies, and a political structure that rewarded endurance and loyalty. Across the sea, Carthage stood in sharp contrast. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, the city, called Carthage, New City, had grown into the wealthiest metropolis in the western Mediterranean. Its influence spread from North Africa to Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and especially Sicily, where Punic settlements had flourished for centuries. Carthage's strength lay in its fleet, vast, experienced, and commanded by admirals whose seamanship was unrivaled. Its government was a merchant oligarchy, focused on trade and profit, not territorial conquest. Through silver mines in Spain, agriculture in Africa, and a vast maritime network, Carthage dominated the sea as completely as Rome dominated the land. The two powers were not natural enemies. In fact, they had been allies before. During the wars with Pyrrhus, Carthage had offered Rome naval support, seeing the Epirote king as a mutual threat. Earlier treaties, recorded by Polybius, the Greek historian writing in the 2nd century BCE, outlined clear spheres of influence. The first, around 509 BCE, limited Roman trade in Carthaginian territories and established a diplomatic understanding between the two. Subsequent agreements after 348 BCE and 306 BCE reaffirmed this boundary. Rome in Italy, Carthage at sea. For generations, this arrangement had maintained an uneasy peace. But beneath the surface of these accords, tension simmered. The treaties defined what each power could not do, but they did not define what each might one day desire. As Rome grew stronger and more secure in Italy, the Senate's gaze drifted outward. Sicily, lying scarcely 3 kilometers across the Strait of Messana, was the logical next step. To dominate Sicily was to control the maritime corridor between east and west, north and south, a command of grain, trade, and naval movement. To the Romans, who saw every frontier as a potential threat, leaving such an island in foreign hands seemed increasingly intolerable. Sicily, at the dawn of the 3rd century BCE, was a mosaic of cultures and rival powers. The eastern regions were dominated by Greek colonies, Syracuse, Gela, and Catana, heirs of the great Hellenic expansion centuries earlier. The west was firmly under Carthaginian control, anchored by cities like Lilybaeum and Panormus. Between them lived the Sicels and other native peoples, often caught in the middle of larger struggles. For decades, the island had been a stage for wars between Greeks and Carthaginians, with each side claiming victory but never achieving lasting dominance. The balance was delicate, yet stable, until the rise of one small, violent faction upset it entirely. That faction was the Mamertines, mercenaries from Campania, men who once fought for Syracuse's rulers but turned to banditry when their employment ended. Around 288 BCE, they seized the city of Messana, slaughtered its male inhabitants, and enslaved the rest. For over 2 decades, they ruled as pirates and plunderers, raiding the countryside and extorting neighboring towns. Their presence destabilized the region, drawing the ire of Hiero II, the powerful and pragmatic tyrant of Syracuse, who sought to restore order and extend his own influence. By 265 BCE, Hiero's forces had pushed the Mamertines to the brink of defeat. Desperate, the mercenaries looked for external salvation, and their appeal would light the match that set the Mediterranean ablaze. At first, the Mamertines turned to Carthage. The Punic commanders, ever eager to secure another strategic port, responded quickly. A small Carthaginian garrison was stationed in Messana, their ships anchoring in its harbor. For Carthage, this was a routine maneuver, one more foothold on Sicily's northern edge. But for Rome, it was something far more alarming. Messana lay directly opposite the Italian mainland. Carthaginian troops there meant that a foreign power had established a base less than 3 miles from Roman soil. When the Mamertines sent envoys to the Roman Senate, begging for help to expel their new Carthaginian protectors, the Senate hesitated. Intervention would mean entering a foreign war in a territory long accepted as Carthaginian influence. Conservative senators warned against it. Others argued that to do nothing would invite Carthaginian encirclement. The debate was fierce, and our best ancient source, Polybius, records how Rome's decision was not one of necessity, but ambition. In the end, opportunism prevailed. The Senate resolved to intervene, not to save the Mamertines, but to deny Carthage. This was not yet war, but it was a violation of the peace that had held for over half a century. In 264 BCE, Consul Appius Claudius Caudex was dispatched across the Strait of Messina with a contingent of troops. The crossing was symbolic, the first time a Roman army had left the Italian mainland to fight on foreign soil. Polybius calls this the precise moment the First Punic War began. The Carthaginian commander in Messana, aware of Rome's move, attempted negotiation. But the Mamertines, sensing a power shift, betrayed their Punic allies and opened the gates to the Romans. Carthaginian forces withdrew, but not without resentment. Almost immediately, Hiero II of Syracuse, who had sought to destroy the Mamertines himself, declared war on Rome. The opening engagements were swift. Roman forces defeated Syracuse's troops near Messana and then repelled a Carthaginian counterattack. Hiero, recognizing the futility of fighting both powers, quickly sought peace. In 263 BCE, he signed an alliance with Rome, one that would endure for decades. Rome now held a permanent position on Sicily. The Republic had crossed into the maritime sphere, and Carthage could no longer ignore it. For both, the conflict that began as a local Sicilian affair was now a confrontation between two rising systems: the disciplined militarism of a continental republic and the commercial naval empire of a mercantile power. Neither side could fully comprehend what they had unleashed. Historians like Adrian Goldsworthy and Dexter Hoyos note that the First Punic War was not inevitable, but it was predictable. Both states were expansionist by nature, one driven by economic need, the other by strategic insecurity. The Mamertine crisis merely accelerated what centuries of proximity had already made likely. In the years that followed, the war would evolve from limited intervention to total struggle, consuming fleets, armies, and treasuries across a generation. The stage was set. Rome, now committed beyond its shores, would discover the true cost of maritime war. Carthage, challenged for the first time on its own element, would defend its legacy with every ship it could muster. And between them lay Sicily, the island that had drawn two great civilizations into collision, a battleground where the destinies of both would be decided. This was the world before 264 BCE, a sea divided not by water, but by purpose. North of it stood a republic learning the language of conquest. South of it sailed an empire fluent in the art of survival. Soon, their words would meet in fire and iron, and the balance of the ancient Mediterranean would change forever. The year was 264 BCE. In the narrow channel dividing Italy from Sicily, the currents ran swiftly, but not as swiftly as the currents of ambition and fear now pulling two great powers toward war. At its center stood the city of Messana, perched on the northeastern tip of Sicily, overlooking the strait. To the casual observer, it was just another fortified harbor, a trading town surrounded by rich farmland and guarded by steep hills. Yet its position made it one of the most strategic points in the ancient Mediterranean. Whoever held Messana could control the movement of fleets between the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas. To Carthage, it was a valuable station. To Rome, it was a potential threat. And to the Mamertines who ruled it, it was a fortress of last resort, a place from which to plead, deceive, and survive. The Mamertines, their name meaning sons of Mars, were no legitimate rulers. They were Campanian mercenaries, men who once fought under the Syracusan tyrant Agathocles and then turned to banditry after his death. Around 288 BCE, they had seized Messana by treachery, slaughtering its citizens and taking their women and property. For decades, they terrorized the surrounding countryside, raiding Greek and Sicil settlements alike. But their luck was running out. By the mid-260s BCE, Hiero II of Syracuse, a former general who had risen from the chaos of Sicily's internal wars, had consolidated power in the island east. Determined to restore order and eliminate these marauders, Hiero moved against Messana with an army of disciplined hoplites and siege engines. Facing defeat, the Mamertines did what they had always done. They turned to others for help. Their first appeal went to Carthage, the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians responded swiftly and pragmatically. They dispatched a small garrison under a commander named Hanno, who sailed into Messana's harbor and established a Punic presence in the city. For Carthage, this was a straightforward move, securing another foothold on Sicily, maintaining the balance of power against Syracuse, and safeguarding its trade routes through the strait. But for the Mamertines, the arrival of Carthaginian troops was a mixed blessing. They had invited aid, only to realize they had exchanged one overlord for another. The Punic garrison behaved as an occupying force, not as allies. Soon after, internal factions within Messana began to argue over allegiance, some favoring Carthage, others Rome. A group of Mamertine envoys crossed the narrow strait to appeal to the Roman Senate, offering alliance and loyalty in exchange for protection. The Roman Senate faced a dilemma without precedent. Sicily lay outside the Italian peninsula, beyond the limits of any Roman treaty or claim. To intervene would mean violating the long-standing understandings with Carthage. Yet the idea of a Carthaginian garrison controlling a city so close to the Italian mainland was deeply unsettling. Only a few miles of water separated Messana from the Roman base at Rhegium. Any Punic expansion there would bring Carthaginian influence directly into Rome's sphere. Debate within the Senate was intense. Conservative voices argued that aiding the Mamertines, pirates and murderers by any definition, would stain Rome's honor. The Republic had always justified its wars as defensive or righteous. Aligning with mercenaries would contradict the moral image Rome projected both at home and abroad. Others, however, viewed the situation more strategically. The historian Polybius records that it was not morality, but fear, the fear of Carthaginian encirclement that carried the day. If Rome allowed Carthage to hold Messana unchallenged, it would give the Punic fleet a staging ground for operations against Italy. In the end, realpolitik prevailed over principle. The Senate voted to intervene, though not unanimously. The consul Appius Claudius Caudex was given command of the expedition. His task, to cross into Sicily, expel the Carthaginian garrison, and secure an alliance with the Mamertines. It was a bold and unprecedented decision, the first time a Roman army would leave the Italian mainland to engage in a foreign war. According to Polybius, when news of the Senate's decision reached Carthage, the Punic leadership was incensed. They viewed Roman intervention as a direct breach of the existing treaties. The Carthaginians had acted first in response to a plea for help. They had stationed troops on the island within their recognized sphere of influence. Now, Rome had crossed a boundary both literal and diplomatic. Even so, the Carthaginian commanders in Sicily initially avoided open war. Hanno, the garrison leader in Messana, tried to negotiate. But the Mamertines, sensing the tide turning in Rome's favor, betrayed their Punic allies. They arrested Hanno and handed control of the city to the Romans. When Appius Claudius landed his forces at Messana later that year, he entered a city already shifting allegiance, a sign of how fluid loyalties in Sicily had become. The Roman army's arrival did not go uncontested. Both Syracuse and Carthage considered the intervention an act of aggression. Hiero, too, still besieging the city from the south, joined forces with the Carthaginian contingent nearby to confront the Romans. For the first time, a Roman army faced two foreign powers on foreign soil. The engagements that followed were not decisive in scale, but immense in significance. The initial skirmish outside Messana tested the legion's adaptability. Roman tactics, honed on the hills of Italy, met the combined Greek and Punic methods of war. The legionaries, fighting in manipular formation, advanced steadily under missile fire, their heavy infantry pushing through enemy lines with characteristic discipline. Appius Claudius managed to drive back Hiero's forces first, then turned on the Carthaginian detachment, forcing it to retreat toward the west. The victories at Messana, modest though they seemed, shifted the balance of power across the island. Hiero, pragmatic and far-sighted, recognized the danger of continued resistance. By 263 BCE, he negotiated a treaty with Rome, surrendering territory and agreeing to pay tribute in exchange for peace. His decision to align with Rome was both strategic and survivalist. It allowed Syracuse to retain autonomy while avoiding destruction. In turn, Rome gained a stable ally and access to crucial supplies and ports in eastern Sicily. For Carthage, the loss of Syracuse as an ally and the Roman foothold in Messana were alarming developments. What began as a localized crisis had now escalated into open hostility. Both sides began to mobilize on a larger scale, realizing that Sicily, long contested but never unified, was about to become the arena of a full-scale war. The Roman Senate, buoyed by early successes, authorized the consuls to extend their campaigns. Reinforcements were sent across the strait, and the legions began advancing westward into Carthaginian-held territory. Polybius notes that this escalation marked the formal beginning of the First Punic War, dated by historians to 264 BCE. The speed with which the conflict expanded reveals the precarious balance that had existed in the Western Mediterranean. Rome's rise in Italy had created a power vacuum, one that Carthage could no longer ignore. Carthage's economic dominance depended on maintaining control of trade routes, harbors, and coastal cities. Rome's security depended on preventing those same assets from falling into foreign hands. What neither side recognized was that this war would not be short or limited. It would consume both for nearly a generation. At Messana, the two systems collided, not just armies, but ideologies. Carthage fought through mercenaries, paid by its treasury and led by appointed commanders answerable to the merchant elite. Rome fought through its citizens, bound by duty and ambition, serving under magistrates who sought honor and glory. This difference, subtle at first, would shape the entire course of the war. The Carthaginians had the wealth, the Romans the manpower. The Punic fleet ruled the waves, the Roman legions mastered the land. Yet in Sicily, where sea and soil intertwined, neither advantage would prove absolute. The Messana crisis thus stands as the hinge between peace and the longest war of antiquity. It revealed the fragility of the old order and the emerging determination of a republic beginning to see itself as more than a regional power. Within a year of crossing into Sicily, Rome found itself entangled in a war it could neither fully control nor easily escape. The Mamertines, whose desperate pleas had sparked the conflict, soon faded from history, their city occupied, their power broken. But their actions had set in motion forces far greater than themselves. For Carthage, the struggle to retain influence in Sicily had begun in earnest. For Rome, the experiment of foreign intervention had already become irreversible. By the end of 263 BCE, the lines were drawn. Rome held the east, Carthage the west. Between them stretched the battleground of Sicily, an island whose soil would soon drink the blood of tens of thousands. The First Punic War had begun, not through grand design or ideology, but through a chain of opportunism, fear, and the relentless momentum of empire. By 262 BCE, the uneasy balance that had gripped Sicily since the crisis at Messana had shattered. The brief alliances and cautious truces of the previous year had collapsed into full war. Carthage and Rome, each claiming to act in defense of their interests, were now mobilizing entire societies for a conflict neither had sought, yet neither could abandon. The question of who would dominate the island, and by extension, the central Mediterranean, would now be decided not by diplomacy, but by siege and slaughter. The city of Agrigentum, known to the Greeks as Acragas, became the focal point of this next phase. It was one of the richest and most magnificent cities in Sicily, perched on a plateau overlooking the southern coast. Founded by Greek colonists centuries earlier, its massive walls enclosed temples, granaries, and homes for tens of thousands. Its position made it a vital strategic stronghold. Whoever held Agrigentum could command the southern plains and project power inland. For Carthage, it was the linchpin of its Sicilian possessions. For Rome, it was the key to breaking Punic control on the island. The Carthaginians, recognizing its importance, stationed a large garrison there under the command of Hannibal Gisco, not to be confused with the later Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Gisco, a seasoned commander and loyal servant of Carthage, fortified the city and stocked it with supplies. He also called upon the surrounding Sicilian towns to contribute troops and provisions. Carthage's aim was clear: turn Agrigentum into a fortress capable of withstanding a prolonged siege, buying time for reinforcements from Africa. The Roman consuls of 262 BCE, Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus, recognized the challenge. Since their arrival in Sicily, the Roman legions had advanced cautiously, learning to fight in a land of mixed terrain and shifting loyalties. But now, with Syracuse secured as an ally and local support growing in the east, the consuls decided to strike a decisive blow. Their target was Agrigentum, a statement that Rome's presence in Sicily would not be temporary. The siege began in earnest late in 262 BCE. The Roman army, numbering over 40,000 soldiers including allies and auxiliaries, surrounded the city and cut off its supply lines. They established fortified camps along the ridges, positioning their artillery to bombard the walls. For the first time in history, Roman engineering faced a Carthaginian stronghold outside Italy. It was an experiment in projection, testing whether the legions, trained for open battle, could sustain the grueling logistics of siege warfare far from home. Inside Agrigentum, the defenders initially held firm. The Carthaginian garrison, supported by local militias, manned the walls with determination. Hannibal Gisco maintained morale, rationed food, and sent out messengers through secret routes to summon help. Polybius, writing a century later, described the siege as one of endurance and attrition, where both sides fought as much against hunger and disease as against the enemy. The countryside surrounding the city suffered most. The Romans ravaged farms and orchards to starve the defenders, while Carthaginian foragers clashed with Roman patrols in bloody skirmishes. Thousands of civilians, trapped between the lines, fled or perished. As months dragged on, the situation inside the city worsened. Grain ran short, and pestilence began to spread. Hannibal Gisco's messages reached Carthage, urging immediate relief. Carthage responded with resolve. A relief army was assembled under the command of Hanno the Elder, one of the leading generals of the Punic state. He gathered mercenaries from Africa, Numidian cavalry from the deserts, and citizen troops from Carthage itself, a diverse but formidable force. Estimates from later historians suggest his army may have numbered around 50,000, supported by war elephants and supply trains. Hanno sailed across from Africa to Heraclea Minoa, west of Agrigentum, and began his march eastward to lift the siege. For the Romans, news of Hanno's arrival was both alarming and invigorating. The consuls realized they would soon face the full might of Carthage in open battle, the first large-scale confrontation between the two powers. Before engaging, they tightened their blockade around Agrigentum, determined to prevent any breakout or resupply. Yet their own situation was growing precarious. The Roman army had been in the field for months. Disease, heat, and shortages took their toll. Polybius notes that Roman foragers, driven by desperation, ventured too far from their camps, only to be ambushed by Hanno's cavalry. The conflict escalated into a war of movement and counter-movement. Hanno established his camp near the river Halacus, close enough to threaten the Roman supply lines. His cavalry dominated the open plains, harassing Roman convoys and isolating detachments. The Numidian horsemen, masters of hit-and-run tactics, became a new and terrifying enemy for the Roman infantry, who were unaccustomed to such mobility. For weeks, Hanno maintained pressure without committing to a full assault, waiting for the Romans to weaken from starvation and exhaustion. But the Roman command refused to yield. Despite setbacks, they reorganized their camps and improved their foraging discipline. When reports reached them that Agrigentum's defenders were on the brink of collapse, the consuls decided to strike before Hanno could coordinate with the garrison. Late in 261 BCE, the decisive confrontation came. The battle outside Agrigentum was fierce and chaotic, a clash that revealed the contrasting strengths of the two civilizations. The Carthaginians advanced with their elephants leading the charge, trampling the front lines and scattering skirmishers. Behind them came mercenary infantry from Iberia and Liguria, seasoned but diverse in language and method. The Roman legions, however, stood firm. Adapting their manipular formations, they opened lanes to let the elephants pass, then surrounded and cut them down with spears and javelins. Once the beasts were neutralized, the Romans pressed forward. The disciplined maniples, trained to rotate through lines under pressure, gradually pushed back the mercenary ranks. Hanno's cavalry counterattacked, striking the Roman flanks, but the allied Italian horsemen held their ground. The fighting lasted for hours under the Sicilian sun, dust and screams mingling with the sound of clashing metal. When the Carthaginian line finally broke, the retreat turned into a rout. Thousands were slain or captured. Hanno escaped with the remnants of his force, abandoning Agrigentum to its fate. Inside the city, Hannibal Gisco, realizing relief would not come, attempted to evacuate under the cover of darkness. He fled with a small escort toward the west, leaving behind his garrison to be overwhelmed. When the Romans entered Agrigentum, they found a city devastated by famine and disease. The population, once among the most prosperous in Sicily, had been reduced to starvation. The Roman soldiers, hardened by months of hardship, plundered what little remained. Thousands of captives were taken and sold into slavery, a brutal but customary practice that would fund future campaigns. The capture of Agrigentum was a watershed moment. It marked the first major Roman victory outside the Italian mainland and demonstrated that the legions could sustain extended operations far from their home base. It also revealed the scale of what lay ahead. The war, initially confined to one island, was now fully continental in scope. Carthage, though defeated in one battle, still commanded the sea and controlled much of western Sicily. In Rome, the news of victory was met with triumph. The Senate and people celebrated their consuls, proclaiming that the gods favored their arms even across the sea. Yet among the more reflective senators, there was unease. The war had demanded unprecedented resources and logistics. Maintaining such campaigns would require more than courage. It would require control of the Mediterranean itself. Polybius, analyzing the war generations later, identified Agrigentum as the true beginning of Rome's imperial transformation. Here, for the first time, Rome confronted the need to project sustained power overseas. The siege tested not only Roman endurance, but Roman identity. Could a republic founded on the defense of Italy now justify conquest abroad? Meanwhile, in Carthage, the defeat sent shockwaves through the Senate. The loss of Agrigentum was both a strategic and symbolic blow. It showed that the Roman legions were not the provincial army Carthage had imagined. Punic leaders recognized that as long as Rome could transport troops to Sicily, Carthage's position would remain precarious. And since Rome lacked a navy, Carthage expected the next phase of war to favor them. Indeed, Carthage's admirals began planning a counteroffensive by sea, raiding the Italian coasts and reinforcing strongholds at Panormus and Lilybaeum. But the Romans, as history would soon reveal, were quick learners. The lessons of Agrigentum, the hunger, the isolation, the dependence on borrowed ships, convinced them that control of the seas would decide the war's outcome. In the years that followed, the Republic would embark on one of the most astonishing naval revolutions of the ancient world. Yet, for the moment, Sicily lay scarred and divided. The fields around Agrigentum were littered with the dead, the city smoldering under Roman occupation. Refugees streamed toward Carthaginian territory in the west. The war that had begun over a band of mercenaries in Messana was now consuming entire regions, dragging Rome and Carthage into a struggle neither had foreseen. The fall of Agrigentum did not end the war. It only hardened its logic. Carthage vowed revenge. Rome, emboldened by victory, looked outward with new ambition. The Mediterranean world had changed. The balance of centuries was tilting, slowly but irrevocably, toward the Republic rising from across the strait. The fall of Agrigentum in 261 BCE marked not the end, but the rebirth of the conflict. Rome had proven its capacity to win on land, yet Sicily was an island, and the island was ruled not by those who held the fields, but by those who commanded the sea. Every fortress, every port, every grain shipment depended upon the waters between Italy and Africa. For the first time in its history, the Roman Republic confronted the reality that victory required mastery of the Mediterranean. Up to this point, Rome's identity had been deeply terrestrial. The legions were instruments of the soil, disciplined, enduring, and bred for the march. Their power rested on a network of colonies and roads stretching across the Italian peninsula. The sea was foreign to them, a frontier of merchants, pirates, and foreign powers. Carthage, in contrast, was born from the sea. Founded by Phoenician traders centuries earlier, its wealth and survival depended on maritime commerce. Its fleets patrolled trade routes from North Africa to Sardinia, from Spain to the Levant. When the Romans gazed across the Strait of Messina towards Sicily's western shores, they saw not only the glittering water, but also the reflection of their limitation. The Punic fleet could strike at will, landing troops, blockading ports, and supplying their garrisons. Even after Agrigentum's loss, Carthage remained secure because of its navy, the finest in the ancient world. The Roman consuls understood that unless the Republic could meet the Carthaginians at sea, all victories on land would crumble into futility. Thus, in 261 BCE, the Roman Senate authorized one of the most ambitious projects of the ancient age, the creation of a war fleet from nothing. No precedent guided them. No institutional memory existed. The Republic had merchant vessels and coastal patrol boats, but nothing capable of facing the sleek, bronze-beaked quinquiremes of Carthage, five-tiered oared warships designed for ramming and speed. Polybius, our most detailed source, relates that fortune favored Roman innovation. A Carthaginian quinquireme had run aground and been captured during coastal skirmishes near southern Italy. The Romans seized it and used it as a template. Shipwrights, working under senatorial supervision, copied its dimensions plank for plank. Within months, the Roman docks at Ostia, Antium, and Neapolis thundered with the sound of axes and hammers. Thousands of carpenters, laborers, and slaves labored day and night, felling timber from Italy's forests and shaping it into warships. The scale of the undertaking was immense. Each quinquireme required about 300 rowers and 120 marines. To crew 100 ships demanded over 40,000 men, a human infrastructure Rome had never attempted to coordinate. The Senate ordered mass recruitment of citizens and allies, conscripting even those who had never set foot on a deck. Training them was another challenge entirely. Polybius describes how the Romans, lacking sea experience, built wooden benches on land and trained recruits to row in unison to the rhythm of flutes. Day after day, men practiced the intricate synchronization of the oars, up, down, pull, recover, until muscle memory replaced ignorance. Yet the Romans were not content merely to imitate Carthage. They intended to neutralize Carthaginian superiority through invention. The Roman engineers devised a device called the corvus, or crow, a heavy wooden boarding bridge about 12 meters long, fitted with a sharp spike at its end. When swung down onto an enemy ship, the spike would pierce the deck, locking the two vessels together. This transformed a naval battle, traditionally a contest of ramming and maneuver, into a floating infantry engagement. In essence, Rome had found a way to turn sea warfare into an extension of land warfare, where their legionary discipline could prevail. By the spring of 260 BCE, the fleet was ready. Command was given to the consul Gaius Duilius, a man with no naval pedigree but the political trust of the Senate. His orders were bold: to take the war directly to the Carthaginians and secure Roman dominance of the strait. The first test would come swiftly. Off the northern coast of Sicily, near the port of Mylae, modern Milazzo, a Carthaginian fleet approached, confident in its superiority. The Carthaginian admiral Hannibal, son of Hanno, commanded around 130 ships, experienced crews accustomed to the fluid tactics of naval engagement. They had little reason to fear these newly built Roman contraptions, manned by farmers turned sailors. The confrontation at Mylae was a meeting of opposites: experience versus innovation, fluidity versus rigidity, sea against land. The Carthaginian plan was straightforward: overwhelm the Romans through speed, outflank them, and sink them through ramming attacks. Their oarsmen rowed with the rhythm of generations of sailors. Their hulls glided through the surf like blades. The Romans, slower and clumsier, appeared easy prey. But when the first Carthaginian ship closed in, Duilius gave the signal. As the enemy vessel lunged forward to ram, the corvus swung down. The massive plank slammed into the Carthaginian deck, the iron spike embedding deep into the wood. Instantly, Roman marines surged across the bridge, swords, shields, and pila in hand. The naval battle transformed into a melee. The Carthaginians, trained for oar and rudder, found themselves fighting legionaries in close quarters. Within minutes, the first Carthaginian ship was seized. Others soon followed. Each attempt to circle the Roman formation brought another Punic ship into the deadly reach of the Corvus. The more agile Carthaginian commanders, realizing the trap, tried to keep their distance, but the narrow waters near Mylae limited maneuver. As the battle unfolded, Roman discipline and numbers told. One after another, Carthaginian ships were boarded, captured, or sunk. By the end of the day, the Carthaginians had lost more than 50 vessels. It was a catastrophic defeat, the first time in recorded history that Carthage had been bested at sea. Gaius Duilius, who had once been an untested commander, returned to Rome as a hero. He celebrated a naval triumph, the first ever in Roman history. In gratitude, the Senate granted him an honor no Roman before him had enjoyed: the right to be accompanied by torchbearers and flute players whenever he walked through the city at night. The column erected in his memory, the Columna Rostrata, was adorned with the bronze beaks of captured ships, a symbol of a new power rising upon the waters. The psychological effect of the victory was immense. The Romans, long accustomed to thinking of themselves as a land power, now glimpsed a new horizon. Sicily, once a distant island, was no longer beyond reach. The Republic had proven that determination could compensate for inexperience, that engineering and discipline could overcome inherited mastery. But Mylae was only the beginning. Carthage, though stunned, remained formidable. The loss stung their pride, yet they quickly adapted. Their admirals refined tactics to counter the Corvus by engaging from a distance or using the wind to strike from behind. Their shipyards in Carthage, Lilybaeum, and Panormus increased production. They were determined that the next engagement would restore their dominance. For Rome, meanwhile, victory brought new challenges. Maintaining a fleet required continuous resources: wood, bronze, sailors, and supplies. The Senate imposed new levies and taxes to sustain construction. The Italian allies, though proud of the triumph, grumbled at the burden. Yet the momentum of war drove all hesitation aside. With each ship launched, Rome's reach expanded. In 260 BCE, the Roman fleet began patrolling the Sicilian and Calabrian coasts, intercepting Carthaginian raiders and securing trade routes. For the first time, the Republic had a maritime frontier. The shift was not merely strategic, but civilizational. Roads and legions had defined Rome's rise. Now, ships and harbors would define its destiny. Still, the new navy's limitations soon became evident. Roman crews remained green, their seamanship unrefined. The Corvus, though ingenious, made ships top-heavy and prone to capsizing in rough weather. In calm seas, it was a weapon; in storms, a liability. Yet the Romans persisted, driven by necessity. The Senate began planning broader operations, not merely to control Sicily, but to strike at Carthaginian power directly. Carthage's empire rested upon the wealth of the sea, the trade in silver from Iberia, grain from Africa, and slaves from distant coasts. To defeat such a power, Rome would need to attack its heart, the African mainland itself. This ambition, unthinkable only a few years before, now began to take shape. The fleet that had triumphed at Mylae would form the foundation for an armada capable of crossing the Mediterranean, the largest the Republic had ever assembled. But before Rome could invade Africa, it had to master the rhythm of the sea itself. The next few years would be a crucible: campaigns of storm, shipwreck, and unrelenting construction. What had begun as a land war in Sicily was transforming into a struggle for maritime supremacy that would test the endurance of both nations. As 260 BC drew to a close, the waters around Sicily shimmered with change. The wrecks of Punic ships at Mylae drifted beneath the waves, their bronze rams glinting in the depths. Above them, Roman patrols sailed. Farmers turned sailors, learning by hardship what no generation of Romans before them had known. The Mediterranean, once divided between Carthage's trade routes and Rome's roads, was now becoming a single theater of war, the stage upon which the fate of two empires would be written. Rome's first naval triumph at Mylae in 260 BCE had shaken the ancient Mediterranean. The Carthaginians, masters of the waves for centuries, had been beaten by an upstart republic that had only just learned to sail. But for the Romans, victory was not enough. They understood now that the war could not be won by isolated battles. To break Carthage's dominance, they needed not only fleets, but mastery, a permanent presence on the sea. Between 259 and 256 BCE, the Republic embarked on a campaign of unprecedented scale, expanding its navy, pressing deeper into Sicilian waters, and carrying the war toward Africa itself. The year 259 BCE opened with renewed Roman confidence. The Senate ordered a massive expansion of the fleet, doubling down on what had worked. New quinquiremes were constructed in Italy's coastal shipyards, Ostia, Neapolis, and Terracina, their hulls built stronger, their prows reinforced with heavier bronze rams. The Corvus boarding bridge, so decisive at Mylae, became standard equipment on nearly every vessel. Crews were trained through relentless drills, and naval legions were formed, infantrymen trained specifically for combat aboard ships. This expansion was more than a military measure. It was a transformation of Roman society. Farmers and artisans from Italy's interior were conscripted into maritime service. For many, it was their first sight of the open sea. Polybius describes how these men, once bound to the soil, now became the pulse of a new naval empire. The Republic's ambition was beginning to exceed the limits of the Italian peninsula. Meanwhile, Carthage recovered from its shock with characteristic pragmatism. The Punic admirals regrouped at Sardinia and western Sicily, determined to restore their control. Carthage still held strongholds at Drepana, modern Trapani, and Lilybaeum, Marsala, both fortified harbors built for endurance. From these ports, their fleets struck out to harass Roman convoys and raid coastal settlements. The Carthaginians were not broken, they were adapting. In 259 BCE, the Roman consuls Lucius Cornelius Scipio and Gaius Aquilius Florus set out to press the war westward. Scipio targeted Corsica and Sardinia, the northern edges of Carthage's network. Though secondary in value compared to Sicily, these islands held symbolic and strategic importance. By capturing them, Rome could disrupt Carthaginian trade and secure safer supply routes. Scipio successfully seized the Corsican city of Illyria, establishing a Roman foothold there, though Carthaginian resistance soon forced him to withdraw. Back in Sicily, Roman operations focused on the heart of Punic strength. The consular armies moved against towns allied to Carthage, Thermae, Camarina, and Mytistraton, while smaller naval contingents patrolled the coast. These campaigns were not decisive but constant, grinding down Punic resources. Sicily became a chessboard of sieges, raids, and counterattacks, each side probing for weakness. The true test came in 258 BCE at the Battle of Sulci, fought off the western coast of Sardinia. A Roman fleet, commanded by the consul Gaius Sulpicius Paterculus, engaged a Carthaginian squadron attempting to protect supply routes between Sardinia and Africa. Once again, the Corvus proved its worth. Though the Carthaginians maneuvered with superior seamanship, they could not outmatch the Roman tactic of forced boarding. Dozens of Punic ships were captured or destroyed, and their commander, Hannibal Gisco, was captured and later crucified by his own people for the defeat. The victory at Sulci strengthened Roman morale and confirmed that Mylae had not been a fluke. Yet, the war showed no sign of ending. Sicily's central plains remained contested, and Carthage refused to sue for peace. Both powers understood that control of the island would determine dominance of the western Mediterranean. By 257 BCE, Rome's naval production reached unprecedented levels. The Republic could now field a fleet of over 250 quinquiremes, a maritime force rivaling any in the ancient world. With this power, the Romans moved to challenge Carthage directly along the western Sicilian coast. That year, off Tyndaris, modern Tindari, a Roman squadron under Gaius Atilius Regulus engaged the Carthaginian fleet in a fierce encounter. The Romans, eager to attack, advanced prematurely before their formation had fully assembled. The Carthaginians seized the opportunity and struck at the scattered vanguard. However, as they pressed forward, the remaining Roman ships closed in. Using the corvus, the Romans captured several enemy vessels, forcing the rest to withdraw. Though tactically inconclusive, the battle reinforced Roman momentum and eroded Carthaginian confidence further. The following year would bring the war to its peak at sea. By 256 BCE, Rome and Carthage had fought for 8 relentless years, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. The Senate now approved a daring plan, one that would carry the conflict beyond Sicily altogether. The consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus proposed an invasion of North Africa itself. If Rome could land an army near Carthage, it could force the enemy to negotiate or face destruction at its doorstep. To accomplish this, the Romans assembled one of the largest naval armadas in ancient history. Polybius gives the figure as 330 Roman ships against a Carthaginian fleet of about 350, over 600 warships in total, each manned by hundreds of rowers and marines. Including support crews and infantry, more than 250,000 men took part in the ensuing confrontation. The scale dwarfed even the naval clashes of later empires. The fleets met off the southern coast of Sicily, near Cape Ecnomus, a promontory jutting into the Mediterranean. The Romans organized their armada into an unusual wedge formation. The consular ships commanded the center, forming the tip of the spear, while the transports carrying the invasion army followed in the rear. The Carthaginians, confident in their maritime superiority, spread their line wide to encircle and crush the Roman wedge. They planned to divide and overwhelm, to destroy the Roman fleet before it could reach Africa. The battle that followed was a maelstrom of noise and chaos. Trumpets blared across the decks, oars thrashed against waves, and the air filled with the crash of rams and the screams of men. The Carthaginian ships, lighter and faster, surged forward, seeking to ram the Roman prows. But once again, the corvus shifted the tide. As the Punic vessels closed in, Roman boarding bridges crashed down upon them, and legionaries stormed across. What should have been a naval engagement became a series of desperate infantry fights across splintered decks. The left wing of the Roman fleet wavered under pressure, but the center, commanded by Regulus and Manlius, held firm. After hours of brutal combat, the Carthaginian formation broke apart. Their fleet, unable to regain maneuvering space, began to scatter. When the smoke cleared, over half of Carthage's ships had been captured or sunk. The Romans had won what Polybius called one of the largest naval victories ever recorded. The outcome of Ecnomus changed the war. For the first time, the Mediterranean's greatest maritime power had lost control of its own waters. Rome, once a landlocked republic, now commanded the sea lanes between Sicily and Africa. The path to invasion was open. In the months that followed, the Romans acted swiftly. The invasion fleet sailed south, making landfall near Cape Bon in modern Tunisia. Regulus led an army of around 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry onto African soil, the first Roman force ever to set foot on the continent. From there, they advanced inland, defeating Carthaginian forces at Aegates and capturing several towns. Panic spread through Carthage. For the first time in its history, the city faced a foreign army threatening its heartland. Yet even amid triumph, Rome's achievement carried the seeds of hubris. The fleet that had borne the legions across the sea now lay vulnerable to storms, and the Republic had little experience managing distant campaigns. The logistical demands of feeding and supplying an army so far from home stretched Roman administration to its limits. Carthage, though battered, was far from broken. Its merchant wealth, its naval infrastructure, and its capacity to hire mercenaries would soon turn the tide again. But for a brief moment in 256 BCE, the Roman dream of victory seemed near. The Senate celebrated the triumph at Ecnomus as proof of divine favor. The Republic had mastered what had once belonged only to Carthage, the sea. Across the Mediterranean, from the Greek cities to the African coast, rulers and merchants watched in astonishment as a city of farmers and soldiers became a maritime power. The Punic world, however, would not accept defeat quietly. Within the walls of Carthage, the Council of Elders debated how to strike back. New ships were ordered, new commanders appointed, and foreign mercenaries, Greeks, Numidians, and Iberians, were summoned to resist the invaders. Among these was a Spartan soldier of fortune named Xanthippus, whose arrival would soon reshape the course of the war. But for now, Rome's banners flew over the Sicilian coast, its fleets patrolled the waters of Africa, and its legions advanced inland with iron resolve. The war that had begun as a quarrel over Messana had become a struggle for dominion across the known world. And yet, as the Romans marched southward under the blazing African sun, few realized that the next chapter of this campaign, and the next year of the war, would bring catastrophe unlike anything they had yet endured. When Marcus Atilius Regulus and his legions landed on the African coast in 256 BCE, the Mediterranean world watched with disbelief. The Romans, once an inland people confined to the hills of Latium, had crossed the sea to bring war to the homeland of Carthage itself. It was an extraordinary moment in the history of the Republic. With the victory at Cape Ecnomus, Rome had proven it could master the seas. Now, with an army on African soil, it sought to end the First Punic War entirely. Regulus, commanding the invasion force, was not content with holding ground. His ambition was imperial, a final blow to cripple Carthage's power and secure Roman supremacy across the western Mediterranean. His consular colleague, Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus, soon returned to Sicily with part of the fleet to guard supply routes, leaving Regulus in sole command of the African campaign. What followed was a bold advance into the rich farmlands of the Carthaginian hinterland, and a chain of victories that seemed to signal the end of Punic resistance. At first, fortune favored the invaders. The Carthaginian army, still reeling from its naval defeats, was unprepared to meet the disciplined Roman legions in open battle. Regulus marched inland and captured the towns of Aspes, modern Polybia, and Aegates, both key positions near the Carthaginian capital. At the Battle of Aegates, fought late in 256 BCE, he inflicted a decisive defeat upon a Carthaginian force commanded by Bostar, Hamilcar, and Hanno, three generals representing the city's competing factions. The Carthaginians, attempting to fight from the high ground, found themselves outmaneuvered. Regulus legions ascended the slopes in tight formations, dislodging the defenders and scattering them. The Carthaginian line collapsed, leaving the Roman army free to plunder the countryside. Carthage itself now stood exposed. Panic spread through the city. The Council of Elders convened emergency sessions, debating whether to sue for peace. Envoys were sent to Regulus' camp to negotiate. But the Roman consul, flush with victory, demanded impossible terms. According to Polybius, Regulus required Carthage to surrender control of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, to pay heavy indemnities, to limit its navy to a single ship, and to acknowledge Roman supremacy. These were not peace terms, they were conditions of servitude. The Carthaginians, stunned and humiliated, refused. They chose to fight on. That decision would soon transform the war. In early 255 BCE, Carthage overhauled its entire military command. The city's leaders realized that their defeat stemmed from internal disunity as much as Roman strength. They turned to an unlikely savior, a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus. He had arrived in Carthage as part of a group of Greek soldiers for hire, but his training and discipline soon caught the attention of the Carthaginian generals. The Spartan's reputation for tactical brilliance reached the council, which invited him to reorganize their shattered forces. Xanthippus introduced a radical change. He understood the weaknesses of the Roman army in African terrain, their reliance on heavy infantry and their lack of mobility. He reorganized Carthage's troops along Hellenistic lines, emphasizing the use of war elephants, cavalry, and light infantry. The Carthaginian army, long accustomed to fighting defensive campaigns, now became a fluid and maneuverable force. When Regulus heard that Carthage was assembling a new army, he dismissed it as desperation. The Roman consul believed the war was already won. His army, however, was isolated, cut off from Sicily, with limited supplies and no fresh reinforcements. The African sun and unfamiliar diseases had begun to wear down the legions. Still, Regulus pressed onward, determined to strike directly at the Carthaginian capital. The two armies finally met on the plains near Tunis, possibly close to the river Bagradas. The Battle of the Bagradas River, fought in the spring of 255 BCE, would become one of the most dramatic reversals in Roman history. Xanthippus deployed his troops with precision. He placed his war elephants, around 100 of them, at the center of his line, forming a living wall of ivory and muscle. Behind them stood ranks of Carthaginian infantry and mercenaries, while the cavalry, composed largely of Numidian horsemen, guarded both flanks. The Romans, as always, arrayed themselves in deep, disciplined formations. Their legions formed solid blocks of infantry, confident that their sheer strength would overwhelm the enemy, as it had so often before. As the battle began, the elephants advanced first, trumpeting and trampling across the plain. The Roman front ranks broke formation to hurl javelins, but the beasts crashed into them with unstoppable force. Men were tossed aside or crushed beneath massive feet. Amid the confusion, the Numidian cavalry swept around the Roman flanks, cutting off retreat and harassing the rear. Regulus tried to rally his men, ordering them to close ranks, but the field dissolved into chaos. Dust and screams filled the air. The Roman formation, trapped between elephants in front and cavalry on both sides, began to crumble. Xanthippus exploited every weakness. His infantry, advancing in tight coordination behind the elephants, drove into the disoriented legions. By midday, the Roman army had been annihilated. Of the roughly 15,000 men who had landed in Africa, fewer than 2,000 managed to escape to Aspes. Only a handful of ships remained to take them back to Sicily. Regulus himself was captured. A consul of Rome paraded through Carthage as a prisoner. For the Republic, it was a catastrophe of staggering proportions. Carthage had turned the tide of war. The victory at Bagradas restored its honor and secured its survival. Xanthippus was celebrated as a savior, though his fate remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he was rewarded and sent home. Others claim the Carthaginians, jealous of his fame, had him executed during the voyage. Whatever the truth, his intervention had saved the Punic state from annihilation. But the war was not yet over. The surviving Roman troops, trapped in Aspes, faced starvation and disease. The Senate in Rome, horrified by news of the disaster, ordered a rescue operation. In the summer of 255 BCE, a massive relief fleet, said to number more than 350 ships, sailed to Africa under the command of the consuls Servius Fulvius Pietinus Nobilior and Marcus Aemilius Paulus. They arrived in time to recover the survivors and defeat the Carthaginian navy once more near Cape Hermaeum, capturing or sinking over 100 enemy vessels. Yet as the Roman fleet turned northward, disaster struck again, this time from the sea. Off the coast of Sicily, near Camarina, a violent storm swept across the Mediterranean. The fleet, heavily laden and poorly balanced with the cumbersome Corvus boarding devices, was unable to maneuver. Polybius reports that 284 ships were wrecked and over 100,000 men drowned, a loss unmatched in the Republic's naval history. The sea that had delivered them victory now became their grave. The First Punic War had reached a cruel symmetry. In the space of a single year, both Rome and Carthage had suffered devastating losses, one by land, the other by sea. Each side had learned that mastery of the Mediterranean came at a terrible cost. Back in Rome, the mood shifted from triumph to grim determination. The Senate declared national mourning for the fallen and began to rebuild, ordering new fleets and fresh levies. To the Romans, defeat was never final. It was merely a call to endure longer than their enemies. Despite losing so many ships, shipyards across Italy roared back to life. The Republic's resilience, its capacity to absorb disaster and rise again, became the foundation of its eventual empire. Carthage, too, recovered quickly. With the Roman invasion repelled and the enemy fleet destroyed by nature, the city regained its confidence. Carthaginian forces resumed operations in Sicily, reoccupying towns lost to the Romans and reinforcing their western strongholds at Lilybaeum and Drepana. The balance of power had reset, and the war returned to its original battleground, the island that had started it all. Yet, the lessons of Africa endured. The Romans learned the perils of overextension, of pressing too far into foreign lands without secure logistics or understanding of local terrain. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, realized that even their naval mastery could not guarantee safety from Rome's persistence. Both civilizations, hardened by catastrophe, began preparing for a new and bloodier phase of war, one that would drag on for another decade. As 255 BCE came to an end, the Mediterranean was once again a landscape of ruins and ambition. The storms that had swallowed Rome's fleet were seen by many as divine punishment for arrogance. Yet in the streets of Rome, workers already toiled to rebuild what had been lost. The Republic had tasted defeat, but its will remained unbroken. In Carthage, the people celebrated Xanthippus' victory and the expulsion of the invaders, but beneath the triumph lay unease. They knew the Romans would return, perhaps not this year, perhaps not the next, but inevitably. In return they would. The next years would bring new fleets, new generals, and new tragedies, as the First Punic War entered its most grueling and unpredictable phase. When the storms of 255 BCE swallowed nearly 300 Roman ships and more than 100,000 lives, the Mediterranean itself seemed to conspire against the ambitions of men. Both powers, Rome and Carthage, emerged from the catastrophe shaken but unbroken. What followed were 5 years of grueling endurance, a slow war of attrition fought not for glory but survival. The First Punic War, once marked by sweeping invasions and decisive sea battles, now descended into a brutal contest of sieges, starvation, and stubborn will. In early 254 BCE, the Roman Senate, determined to avenge the disasters of Africa and the sea, began again from the ruins. The Republic's recovery was astonishing. Within months, Italian shipyards from Ostia to Brundisium echoed with the hammering of carpenters and the clatter of iron nails. Timber from the Apennines was dragged to the coasts. Farmers' sons once more became sailors. By the spring of that year, a new fleet, said by Polybius to number 220 warships, was ready to sail. The sheer scale of this reconstruction reflected the Roman spirit. They would not yield to fate. The first campaigns of 254 BCE centered once again on Sicily, the island that had become the war's crucible. Rome's consuls for that year, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina and Aulus Atilius Collatinus led a joint offensive. Their target was the wealthy Punic city of Panormus, modern Palermo, on Sicily's northern coast. Carthage still held key strongholds along the western and southern shores, but Panormus represented both a strategic and symbolic prize. The Roman consuls divided their forces. Scipio commanded the fleet, while Atilius led the legions on land. The siege of Panormus was methodical and relentless. Roman engineers, drawing from years of experience, constructed siege works that gradually choked the city. Carthaginian reinforcements attempted to break the encirclement by sea, but were driven off by Scipio's ships. By the end of the summer, the defenders, starved and surrendered. Panormus fell, and with it came vast stores of grain, silver, and captives. For the first time since their African defeat, the Romans tasted victory again. Carthage responded in kind. Determined not to lose momentum, its commanders reinforced their remaining positions, Lilybaeum, Drepana, and Eryx, fortresses that would dominate the western tip of Sicily for years to come. These cities became the heart of Carthaginian resistance, heavily fortified, supplied by sea, and defended by experienced mercenaries drawn from across the Mediterranean. The following year, 253 BCE, Rome's confidence briefly overreached. Emboldened by the fall of Panormus, the Senate ordered another expedition against Africa, hoping to replicate Regulus's earlier invasion, but without repeating his mistakes. The consuls Publius Servilius Geminus and Gaius Sempronius Blasus led a massive fleet of 260 ships. They crossed the sea unopposed, raided the Carthaginian coast near Cape Bon, and burned several coastal settlements. Yet, as before, the sea proved the true adversary. On the return voyage, a sudden storm caught the fleet off southern Sicily, destroying over 150 ships and drowning thousands. Rome was forced once again to face its greatest weakness, its unfamiliarity with the sea. Carthage, by contrast, had adapted. Learning from earlier defeats, its admirals avoided confrontations, striking instead at Roman transports and isolated convoys. The war's tempo slowed. From 252 to 251 BCE, both powers turned inward. Rome struggled to rebuild its shattered fleets while maintaining pressure on land. Carthage, exhausted financially, leaned heavily on mercenary forces, Libyans, Iberians, and Celts, promising pay that the state could scarcely afford. Sicily became a wasteland of burned farms and ruined cities. Campaigns degenerated into endless sieges. It was during this stagnant period that a new figure rose to prominence, Lucius Caecilius Metellus. A pragmatic soldier with a disciplined mind, Metellus was appointed consul in 251 BCE and dispatched to Sicily to stabilize Rome's position. His opportunity came soon after, in what would become one of the most remarkable Roman victories of the war, the Battle of Panormus in 250 BCE. That summer, a Carthaginian army under Hasdrubal, not to be confused with Hamilcar's later son, advanced eastward from Lilybaeum, intending to retake Panormus. Confident after years of Roman misfortune, Hasdrubal brought with him a contingent of war elephants, hoping to crush the Roman legions as Xanthippus had done in Africa. The elephants, symbol of Carthaginian might, were the terror of the battlefield, massive creatures whose charge could break any formation. Metellus, however, was prepared. Anticipating Hasdrubal's movements, he chose his ground carefully near the city's walls, where trenches and ditches could disrupt a charge. When the Carthaginian army arrived, Metellus kept his troops behind the fortifications, provoking Hasdrubal into advancing recklessly. As the elephants approached, the Romans unleashed volleys of javelins and stones, pelting the animals from the walls and from concealed positions behind the ditches. Panic spread among the beasts. In their confusion, they turned back, trampling Carthaginian infantry and collapsing the formation. Seizing the moment, Metellus ordered a counterattack. The legions poured from the gates and drove Hasdrubal's men into rout. By the day's end, the Carthaginian army was destroyed, and nearly all of its elephants, over 100, according to later Roman sources, were captured. Some were paraded through Rome in triumph. Others were killed in public games. The victory at Panormus was more than military. It was psychological. Rome had exorcised the terror of Xanthippus, elephants, and restored its faith in its infantry's invincibility. Carthage, however, remained entrenched in western Sicily. Its strongholds, Lilybaeum and Drepana, stood like iron gates barring Roman expansion. The Senate, flush with confidence from Metellus' victory, decided to end the war once and for all. The plan was bold: besiege Lilybaeum, Carthage's greatest fortress in Sicily, and cut off its supply lines from Africa. Lilybaeum, located at the island's westernmost tip, was more than a city. It was a fortress built for endurance. High walls, deep harbors, and access to the open sea made it nearly impregnable. In 250 BCE, the consuls Gaius Atilius Regulus, a relative of the captured hero, and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus brought a massive force to bear, around 100,000 men and 200 warships. They surrounded the city by land and sea, erecting siege towers and battering rams. But the Carthaginians were ready. Their commander, Himilco, reinforced by the brilliant young Admiral Adherbal, held firm. Carthaginian ships, exploiting their superior seamanship, slipped through the Roman blockade under cover of night, bringing food and reinforcements. Repeated Roman assaults on the walls failed. The city's defenders countered with fire and sorties, burning siege works and killing thousands. The siege dragged on month after month. Both sides suffered from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The stagnant waters around Lilybaeum bred fever and pestilence. Polybius describes how entire Roman camps were consumed by sickness, forcing constant rotation of troops from the mainland. Supplies ran low, morale withered, and mutinies threatened. Yet even in adversity, Rome refused to retreat. The Senate, unwilling to show weakness, dispatched replacement fleets to maintain the blockade. Ship after ship arrived from Italy, many manned by inexperienced crews, many soon lost to storms. Still, the blockade endured. By 250 BCE, the war had become a slow grind, a contest of endurance rather than strategy. Both empires were stretched to their limits. Carthage's treasury was nearly empty. The cost of maintaining mercenary armies drained its coffers. Rome's population groaned under the burden of constant levies and taxes. The Senate resorted to forced loans from wealthy citizens to fund shipbuilding. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, the outlines of Rome's future dominance were beginning to take shape. Its capacity to rebuild after disaster, to fight wars of attrition with patience and system, was unmatched. Even when victory seemed distant, the Republic persisted. In the closing months of 250 BCE, the siege of Lilybaeum continued unresolved, but Rome had entrenched itself permanently on Sicilian soil. The Carthaginian garrisons were isolated, their supply lines threatened. The war, though far from decided, had entered its final act, one that would push both nations to the brink of collapse. For now, the Mediterranean remained a stalemate of attrition, a sea divided between endurance and desperation. The following years would bring new commanders, new fleets, and disasters that would eclipse all those before. The First Punic War had already consumed 14 years. Neither side yet realized that it would still rage for nearly a decade more. By 249 BCE, the First Punic War had become a generation's burden. Young men who had been born when the conflict began now marched as soldiers, inheriting a struggle older than themselves. Sicily was scarred and exhausted. Towns lay in ruins, fields were untended, and the once fertile island had become a battlefield of attrition. Yet neither Rome nor Carthage would yield. Both empires were too deeply entangled in pride and necessity to abandon the fight. What followed was a sequence of ruin and recovery, years that tested not only armies but the very endurance of civilizations. The turning point began with Rome's decision to break the stalemate at Lilybaeum. The siege that had dragged on since 250 BCE was bleeding the Republic dry. Despite the massive investment in men and ships, Carthage's stronghold remained unconquered. Its harbor, open to the western winds, allowed reinforcements and supplies to slip through the Roman blockade. For every Roman assault repelled, the defenders seemed to grow bolder. Carthaginian commanders, among them Adherbal and Hamilco, used smaller, faster vessels to outmaneuver Rome's heavy quinquiremes. By 249 BCE, frustration within the Roman camp had turned into desperation. That year, the Senate appointed a new consul, Publius Claudius Pulcher, to bring the siege to an end. Pulcher came from one of Rome's most ancient and arrogant families, and his appointment symbolized the Senate's determination to crush Carthage's resistance. He arrived in Sicily with fresh troops and a belief that boldness, not caution, would deliver victory. His fleet, numbering about 120 warships, was tasked with blockading Lilybaeum and, if possible, destroying the Carthaginian naval presence once and for all. Yet Pulcher's confidence would soon become Rome's undoing. In the spring of 249 BCE, he learned that a Carthaginian fleet under Adherbal was anchored near Drepana, just north of Lilybaeum. Rather than waiting for favorable conditions, Pulcher decided to strike immediately, hoping to catch the enemy unprepared. It was a fateful choice. The Roman fleet set sail at night, creeping northward along the Sicilian coast. But the operation quickly fell apart. The wind shifted, scattering formations. The cumbersome quinquiremes lost coordination. By dawn, the fleet approached Drepana's harbor in confusion. Adherbal, recognizing the Romans' disarray, acted swiftly. Ordering his crews to cut anchor, he led his ships out to sea in a wide arc, gaining the open water before Pulcher could deploy his fleet. What followed was one of the worst naval defeats in Roman history. The Battle of Drepana, fought in 249 BCE, exposed every weakness in the Republic's maritime strategy. Adherbal's ships, lighter, faster, and crewed by veteran sailors, maneuvered effortlessly, outflanking the Roman squadrons. Pulcher's formation, pressed against the rocky coastline, had no room to maneuver. The Carthaginian rams struck relentlessly, shattering hulls and splintering oars. By midday, 93 Roman ships had been captured or sunk. The rest fled south toward Lilybaeum. Legend preserved the story of Pulcher's arrogance through a bitter irony. Before the battle, he had performed the traditional ritual of consulting the sacred chickens, a divination to determine whether the gods favored combat. When the birds refused to eat, a bad omen, Pulcher reportedly hurled them into the sea, sneering, "If they will not eat, then let them drink." The gods, it seemed, answered with catastrophe. The defeat at Drepana shattered Rome's naval confidence. For the first time in the war, the Republic faced a complete maritime collapse. As if to compound the disaster, a second Roman fleet soon met destruction near Cape Passaro when violent storms swept across the straits. Hundreds of ships were lost and thousands of sailors drowned. Rome, drained of resources and morale, decided to abandon large-scale naval operations altogether. The Senate, now financially crippled, suspended shipbuilding. The cost of maintaining massive fleets had bankrupted many of Italy's aristocratic families. Instead, Rome shifted its focus back to land warfare, to the slow, grinding campaign across Sicily's mountains and plains. Carthage, however, found little reason to celebrate. Though victorious at sea, its situation remained precarious. The city's coffers were nearly empty. The war had consumed not only its ships and men, but also its trade. The merchant fleets that once crisscrossed the Mediterranean carrying silver, grain, and luxury goods now lay idle or destroyed. With each passing year, Carthage's economy withered under the strain of prolonged conflict. Yet amid the exhaustion, one man emerged who would reshape the final years of the war: Hamilcar Barca. Appointed by Carthage's council in 247 BCE, Hamilcar was young, determined, and unorthodox. His name would one day be remembered as the father of Hannibal, but in this moment, he was a commander facing impossible odds. The situation he inherited was grim. Carthaginian forces in Sicily had been reduced to a handful of coastal fortresses: Lilybaeum, Drepana, and Eryx, cut off from one another and dependent on sporadic supply runs from Africa. The Roman legions controlled the interior and most of the eastern coast. Hamilcar realized that conventional warfare could no longer save Carthage. The city lacked the resources for open battles or grand sieges. Instead, he turned to a new kind of war, one that would combine audacity, mobility, and psychological warfare. He began by seizing Mount Eryx, a towering peak overlooking the western coast near Drepana. From this natural fortress, Hamilcar could strike deep into Roman-held territory, raid supply lines, and retreat before retaliation. His troops, a mix of Libyan, Iberian, and Gallic mercenaries, became a force of constant harassment. Roman camps burned, convoys vanished, and morale in Sicily began to falter. Hamilcar's tactics reflected the precision of a strategist who understood his enemy. He avoided pitched battles, knowing that Rome's legions excelled in confrontation. Instead, he relied on speed, deception, and terrain. At night, his men launched sudden assaults on isolated garrisons. By dawn, they disappeared into the hills. Even Roman sources, usually disdainful of Carthaginian generals, admired his ingenuity. Polybius later described him as the most brilliant Carthaginian commander of his time. The years 248 and 247 BCE became a period of relentless guerrilla warfare. Hamilcar's control of the western highlands gave Carthage a tenuous foothold in Sicily even as its navy struggled to maintain supply routes. His presence forced Rome to commit more troops than ever, stretching its manpower thin. At the same time, Hamilcar's leadership gave the weary Carthaginian state a symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, in Rome, the war had turned unpopular. The Senate faced growing dissent from citizens exhausted by endless levies and taxes. The losses at Drepana and in the storms had destroyed public faith in the navy, and there was little appetite for new ventures at sea. Many senators favored consolidating existing gains rather than pursuing total victory. Yet others warned that time favored Carthage. As long as the Punic strongholds held, the Republic could not claim Sicily as its own. The island's western harbors, particularly Lilybaeum and Drepana, allowed Carthage to strike back at any moment. The war could not truly end until those ports fell. In 247 BCE, the Roman command in Sicily passed to Gaius Atilius Regulus, the son of the ill-fated consul captured in Africa, and Lucius Lentulus. Their campaign focused on containing Hamilcar's raids and maintaining pressure on Lilybaeum. The struggle turned into a war of starvation. Rome cut off access to inland resources while Carthaginian blockade runners, daring and desperate, slipped supplies through Roman patrols under cover of fog. Both sides grew weaker. The war, now in its 17th year, seemed endless. Sicily's population suffered most. Farmers pressed into military service, towns emptied by famine, and refugees fleeing burned villages. The island's economy collapsed, and even victorious armies marched through desolation. Yet amid this bleak endurance, the foundations of Rome's eventual triumph were taking shape. The Republic's political structure, its capacity to absorb defeat, levy new armies, and tax its citizens, allowed it to outlast its rival. Carthage, though equally determined, lacked such stability. Its reliance on mercenaries, while tactically effective, drained its finances, and fostered resentment among unpaid soldiers. As 247 BCE drew to a close, the balance of power in the western Mediterranean hung by a thread. Carthage, sustained by Hamilcar's genius, still held a fragment of Sicily and commanded the seas. Rome, battered and impoverished, maintained its armies through sheer will. Both sides had suffered beyond measure, yet neither could claim victory. The next phase of the war would be decided not by strength of arms alone, but by endurance, and by Rome's willingness to risk everything once more on the sea. The Republic would soon return to the waters it had abandoned, rebuilding a navy not through the state's wealth, but through the sacrifice of its citizens. The tide, long stagnant, was about to turn again. By 247 BCE, the First Punic War had endured for 17 relentless years. The Mediterranean world had watched two great powers exhaust themselves over a single island. Sicily, once a land of bustling trade and olive groves, had become a graveyard of ambition. But even in the midst of ruin, Rome began to turn its eyes again toward the sea. The Republic, stripped of ships and drained of silver, faced a question that would decide the future of the Mediterranean. Could it build one last fleet, and with it, one last chance at victory? After the disaster at Drepana, Rome had sworn off naval warfare. The Senate's treasury was empty, and repeated storms had destroyed entire fleets. Yet by 243 BCE, the strategic reality was inescapable. Without command of the sea, the legions in Sicily could never finish the war. Carthage still held Lilybaeum and Drepana, fortified coastal bastions supplied by the swiftest Punic ships. On land, Hamilcar Barca's guerrilla campaign had transformed western Sicily into a cauldron of endless raids. Rome could hold the ground, but it could not deliver the final blow. The renewal of Rome's navy began not through the Senate, but through private citizens. According to Polybius, wealthy Roman families, patriots who had watched their fortunes vanish in earlier disasters, resolved to fund the Republic's salvation themselves. They formed consortia, pooling their resources to build and equip ships at personal expense, expecting reimbursement only if victory was achieved. This extraordinary act of civic faith birthed a new fleet of about 200 quinquiremes. But this time, Rome learned from its failures. The cumbersome, storm-ridden designs of the past were abandoned. The new ships, modeled after a captured Carthaginian vessel, were sleeker and more maneuverable. The Romans also improved their crews. Years of defeat had taught hard lessons about seamanship. Training became rigorous, and sailors drilled relentlessly along the Italian coasts. Gone was the blind dependence on boarding bridges like the Corvus that had once given Rome the edge, but made its ships unstable. The Republic now sought to fight Carthage on equal terms, sailor against sailor, helmsman against helmsman. By 242 BCE, this revived fleet was ready for war. The Senate appointed the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus to command it, assisted by the praetor Quintus Valerius Falto. Both men understood the stakes. Sicily's western harbors were the key to Carthage's survival. If Lilybaeum and Drepana could be isolated and cut off from Africa, the Punic forces there, including Hamilcar's troops, would wither. The strategy was as simple as it was ambitious. Blockade every Carthaginian port in Sicily, starve their armies, and intercept any relief fleet sent from Africa. Throughout 242 BCE, Catulus methodically tightened the noose. Roman squadrons patrolled the western sea lanes, intercepting Carthaginian supply convoys. Drepana and Lilybaeum, long lifelines of Punic resistance, found themselves increasingly isolated. Inside the cities, morale crumbled as provisions dwindled. Outside their walls, Hamilcar continued his daring raids from Mount Eryx, but his position grew ever more precarious. He could harass the enemy, but he could not feed his men forever. Carthage, meanwhile, faced a strategic paralysis. Its navy, once the unrivaled master of the Western Mediterranean, was crippled. Years of attrition, corruption, and financial strain had left the state nearly bankrupt. The merchant oligarchy that ruled Carthage hesitated to fund new expeditions. But as the blockade tightened, the council realized that inaction meant death. In early 241 BCE, Carthage scraped together every resource it could muster to form a relief fleet. Shipyards along the North African coast, in Carthage, Hadramedum, and Hippodioritis, sprang to life once more. Timber was hauled from distant forests, oarsmen conscripted from the countryside, and sailors recruited from wherever experience could be found. Command was given to Hanno, tasked with transporting supplies and reinforcements to Hamilcar's stranded army. The fleet, around 250 ships strong, was burdened with grain, weapons, and soldiers. Yet the Carthaginians launched in haste. Many vessels were hastily built or repaired, and the crews were green. Still, they sailed north towards Sicily, unaware that the Romans were waiting. Catullus had received intelligence of the Punic plan. He positioned his fleet off the Aegates Islands, west of Sicily, a cluster of rocky outposts where the wind patterns favored the Romans. His ships were lighter and better equipped, and his men rested and drilled to perfection. But what would decide the battle was not courage or strength, it would be wind and timing. On the morning of March 10th, 241 BCE, as the Carthaginian fleet approached from the west, the sea turned against them. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing fiercely into their faces. Laden with cargo, their ships struggled to maintain formation. Sails flapped uselessly or strained against the waves. Catullus seized the moment. Raising his signal flag, he ordered the attack. The Roman fleet surged forward with terrifying precision. Polybius describes the clash in vivid detail, the disciplined Roman lines crashing into the chaotic Punic advance. The lighter Roman ships, unburdened by supplies, maneuvered swiftly. Their rams struck the heavier Carthaginian hulls with deadly force. Punic vessels, overloaded and poorly manned, were unable to turn quickly or retreat. The battle raged for hours in the churning sea off the Aegates Islands. Wooden hulls splintered under the impact of bronze rams. Oars shattered, men screamed above the roar of the waves. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. The Carthaginian formation collapsed as ship after ship was disabled or captured. When the winds finally calmed, roughly 50 Carthaginian vessels had been sunk and 70 captured. The rest fled westward in disarray, pursued but not annihilated. Catullus, mindful of the weather, held his ships back from overextension. The victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands broke Carthage's back. It was the final and decisive engagement of the First Punic War. With its last fleet destroyed and its garrisons cut off, Carthage had no choice but to sue for peace. When news reached Hamilcar Barca in Sicily, he was furious. His army was still capable of fighting, his defensive position strong. But without supplies or reinforcements, resistance was futile. Reluctantly, he sent envoys to negotiate. The Carthaginian peace delegation arrived in Rome later that year. They were received coldly. The Senate, though weary of war, sensed its advantage. The terms it imposed were harsh but calculated. Carthage was to evacuate all of Sicily and the islands between Sicily and Africa. All prisoners were to be returned without ransom. A massive indemnity was to be paid, 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, a crushing sum that would weigh on Carthage's economy for decades. Thus ended, in 241 BCE, the First Punic War, 23 years after it began. For the first time in history, Rome stood as the undisputed power of the Western Mediterranean. Sicily, the jewel of the conflict, became the Republic's first overseas province. A Roman praetor was installed to govern it from Syracuse, marking the beginning of Rome's transformation from an Italian power to a Mediterranean empire. But victory brought new burdens. The cost of the war had been staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost, soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike. Rome's farms lay abandoned, its treasury depleted. The returning veterans found a republic exhausted but triumphant, its citizens hardened by endurance. For Carthage, the defeat was even more profound. Once the richest maritime power in the known world, the city was now humbled and broken. Its navy lay in ruins, its trade crippled by Roman dominance. Worse still, the indemnity forced heavy taxation on its North African subjects, planting the seeds of internal revolt. Yet amid the ashes, one figure refused to see the war as the end. Hamilcar Barca, though forced to surrender Sicily, withdrew his army with discipline and dignity. He returned to Africa not as a broken general, but as a man with an unfinished purpose. Within a few years, he would crush a massive mercenary rebellion that threatened Carthage itself. And in the aftermath, he would begin building a new base of power in Iberia. There, his son Hannibal would grow up, nurtured in the memory of defeat and the promise of vengeance. For Rome, the aftermath of the First Punic War marked the dawn of the empire. Sicily's annexation gave the Republic its first true province, governed not as a partner, but as a subject. The Senate now faced new questions: how to rule foreign peoples, how to maintain distant garrisons, how to feed the capital with Sicilian grain. The lessons learned here, of sea power, taxation, and provincial control, would shape Roman policy for centuries. But the shadow of Carthage still loomed. Though beaten, the Punic state endured. Its fleets were rebuilt, its merchants slowly reclaimed their trade routes, and its generals watched Rome's rise with growing resentment. The peace of 241 BCE was no true peace, merely a pause between storms. And in the years to come, the sons of those who fought in Sicily would once again meet on the battlefields of the Mediterranean, in a war far greater, far deadlier, and far more personal. For now, however, the waters around the Aegates Islands fell silent. The waves washed over the wrecks of 1,000 ships, Roman and Carthaginian alike, while the world turned toward a new age. Rome, once a landlocked republic, had taken its first step toward maritime empire, and history, as always, demanded its price. By the year 242 BCE, the First Punic War had reached its 20th year. Rome and Carthage stood at the edge of exhaustion, both crushed by the weight of years, debt, and unending loss. The once prosperous island of Sicily had been reduced to a war-torn ruin, its cities besieged, its farmlands wasted, its people living under the shadow of endless conflict. Yet neither side would surrender. In the Senate of Rome, the belief endured that the Republic's destiny demanded victory. In Carthage, the old merchants of the council feared ruin more than defeat. Each power still clung to the hope that one more bold stroke might finally bring the other to its knees. For nearly 2 decades, Rome had dominated the land, while Carthage commanded the sea. But after the catastrophic loss of several fleets to storms and defeat, Rome had nearly abandoned its naval ambitions. The cost of building ships, tens of thousands of trees, thousands of oarsmen, and the vast sums of silver to pay them, was too heavy for the state to bear. The Senate refused to fund another fleet. Rome seemed destined to fight forever across the hills of western Sicily, locked in a stalemate against Carthage's indomitable commander, Hamilcar Barca. Then came a change born of desperation and faith. According to Polybius, around 243 BCE, a group of Roman citizens, senators, merchants, and wealthy patriots offered to finance a new fleet from their own private fortunes. Their proposal was extraordinary. They would build, equip, and crew the ships at their own expense, and only if Rome won the war would the state repay them. It was an act of civic defiance, a declaration that the Republic's cause was too sacred to fail. Thus began the construction of Rome's final navy. In secret shipyards along the Italian coasts, forests were felled and bronze forged into rams. The new quinqueremes, built from lessons learned over 20 years of defeat, were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than before. Rome had abandoned the cumbersome corvus boarding device that had once been its signature advantage. Now, its sailors are trained as true seamen, rowing, maneuvering, and fighting with precision. The legions on land had long been Rome's pride, but the Republic now prepared to meet Carthage on its own element, the open sea. In 242 BCE, the Senate appointed Gaius Latatius Catulus as consul and supreme commander of this new fleet, with Quintus Valerius Falto as his second. Catulus was no reckless adventurer. He understood the magnitude of the task. Carthage still controlled Drepana and Lilybaeum, two heavily fortified ports on Sicily's western coast that served as the lifeline for their army under Hamilcar. If Rome could blockade those ports and choke off their supplies, Carthage's position would become untenable. The campaign began with meticulous planning. Latatius established his naval base at the western tip of Sicily, near the Aegates Islands, 3 rocky outcrops off the coast. From here, his fleet could intercept any Carthaginian reinforcements sailing from Africa. Meanwhile, Roman troops maintained the siege lines around Lilybaeum, ensuring no supplies could move inland. By early 241 BCE, the trap had been set. Inside Carthage, panic gripped the Senate. Its fleet had been decimated in earlier years, and its treasury nearly empty. Yet the merchants and admirals knew what defeat would mean: the loss of Sicily, their trade routes, and perhaps the city's very survival. In haste, they began assembling a relief fleet, around 250 ships, many of them hastily rebuilt and heavily loaded with grain, weapons, and soldiers. The fleet's purpose was not to fight, but to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Hamilcar Barca. Once his army was resupplied, Carthage could continue its guerrilla war indefinitely. Admiral Hanno was given command. Against the advice of his more cautious subordinates, he chose to sail immediately, hoping to reach Sicily before Rome could react. Latatius Catulus, however, was ready. His scouts reported the Carthaginian preparations, and he guessed correctly that they would aim for the Aegates route, the shortest crossing from Africa to Sicily. He ordered his ships to anchor near the islands, waiting for favorable winds. The Roman crews, well-rested and trained, spent the following days preparing for what they knew would be the final confrontation. At dawn on March 10, 241 BCE, the Carthaginian fleet appeared on the horizon. A strong west wind carried them towards Sicily, but it also turned against them. The seas grew rougher as the day broke, and the heavy Carthaginian transports struggled against the waves. Their decks, piled with supplies, made them top-heavy and slow. Their oarsmen, weary from the long voyage, could not keep formation. Then the wind shifted. It now blew from the east into the faces of the Carthaginians. The Romans, sensing their moment, hoisted sail and advanced with the wind behind them. What followed was one of the most decisive naval battles in ancient history, the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Latatius ordered his fleet to form a broad front, spreading across the sea to prevent the Punic ships from slipping past. Roman triremes and quinqueremes rowed in unison, their prows angled to ram. Polybius, who wrote the most detailed account, describes the Roman discipline as unmatched, the product of months of rigorous drilling. The Carthaginians, burdened and out of formation, could neither retreat nor fight effectively. Hanno tried to reorganize his line, but chaos spread as Roman ships began their assault. Bronze rams tore into Carthaginian hulls, splintering wood and sending men into the sea. Roman marines boarded others, fighting hand-to-hand with swords and spears. The once proud Punic sailors, masters of the sea for generations, found themselves trapped, unable to maneuver or turn their prows into the enemy. The battle lasted for hours. Roman persistence wore down Carthage's defenses. When the fighting ended, nearly half the Carthaginian fleet had been destroyed or captured. Polybius records that around 50 ships were sunk, 70 seized, and the rest scattered. The sea was littered with wreckage and bodies, while the surviving Punic ships fled toward the African coast. The Roman victory was total. Laetius Catullus, cautious and methodical, refused to pursue too far into the open sea. The winds were unpredictable, and his own ships had suffered damage. But he had achieved what no Roman before him had accomplished: the destruction of a Carthaginian fleet in open battle, fought not by chance, but by mastery. The consequences were immediate. Hamilcar Barca, still entrenched on Mount Eryx, knew that his position was hopeless. His army, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, could no longer continue the war. Carthage's council, upon receiving word of the disaster, ordered its commanders to seek peace. In the weeks that followed, Carthaginian envoys were sent to Laetius Catullus to negotiate terms. The consul received them not as conquerors often do, but with calculated pragmatism. Rome was weary of war too. Her people wanted peace, not vengeance. But the Senate also knew it held absolute leverage. The resulting treaty, known as the Peace of Laetius, was severe but measured. Carthage was to withdraw from all of Sicily and the nearby islands, return all Roman prisoners without ransom, pay a war indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. The treaty ended the First Punic War, bringing to a close the longest continuous conflict of the ancient Mediterranean, 23 years of uninterrupted struggle. When word reached Rome, the city erupted in relief. Bells rang, sacrifices were made to Jupiter, and the people celebrated the return of peace after a generation of suffering. Sicily, the cause of so much death, was annexed as Rome's first province, governed not as an ally, but as a territory under Roman authority. For Carthage, the news brought despair. The indemnity was crippling, its fleet shattered, its trade disrupted. Yet even in defeat, some dignity remained. Hamilcar Barca, though forced to surrender, withdrew his army with honor, ensuring their safe passage back to Africa. The man who had fought the Romans for years would soon face another trial: the mercenary war that would threaten to destroy Carthage from within. Rome, meanwhile, had transformed. The republic that entered the war in 264 BCE as a regional Italian power emerged in 241 BCE as a Mediterranean force. It had built a navy from nothing, fought across 3 continents, and learned the cost of empire. Sicily would become a vital grain supplier and the template for future Roman provincial administration. The First Punic War had reshaped the Mediterranean world. It ended the era of Greek and Carthaginian dominance in the West, ushering in the Age of Rome. But the peace was uneasy. In Carthage, resentment festered, a deep wound that no treaty could heal. Among the families that survived the ruin, one name stood apart: Barca. Hamilcar's young son, Hannibal, was said to have watched his father's return from the war with wide eyes. In later years, the historian Livy tells us that Hamilcar made the boy swear, before the household gods, eternal hatred toward Rome. Whether legend or truth, the oath captured the spirit of a generation raised on bitterness. For now, though, the seas fell quiet. The smoke of battle lifted from the Aegates Islands, and the Mediterranean, for a brief moment, knew peace. But it was the kind of peace that lives only in the pause between storms. The First Punic War had ended. The second had already begun to take shape, not in the Senate nor in the Council of Carthage, but in the mind of a boy who would one day march across the Alps and bring Rome to its knees.